Final gather is the bouncing and regathering of indirect light in a scene, and provides a terrific way to realistically light, bouncing the light off surfaces depending on their reflectance, and really getting a softness in the rendering. However, it can be a tremendous time hit, and so we should optimize our final gather wherever we can. What we can do, depending on the scene, is to either render the final gather or render it and cache it, and we have some options in here as to how and when we render it. I've opened up the render settings, and I've also run a rendering of my scene, so I can see in here that I've got a good quality in the light. What I'll do is go to the Global Illumination tab, and in the Final Gather here, I'm going to push around some of the values and how it interpolates. My initial point density is fairly low. It's at 0.06, but I've got a good number of rays per point. So I'm doing more than a draft, but less than a low. And if we look here in the presets, for example, by sliding this back to low, we see a dramatic difference. Here's the thing with Final Gather, though. My last render time was 1:19, and if I render with low settings like this, I'll see a difference in time. There's a radical difference in using the low settings. When we deal with Final Gather, we see a huge jump in time with more accuracy. I went from 1:19 a frame to 1:56 just by going up to the low precision presets. I'll pull this back down. I had my initial point density at 0.06, my rays were at 75, and I was interpolating at 40. What we can do, as I've mentioned previously, is to optimize based on positions along a camera path or for stills. I'm going to leave it at stills, but then I'll scroll down further in the Final Gather. In our Final Gather, we have some choices over here about our ray distance, and what I'll do is check Use Falloff. What this does then is say that at some point objects cannot cast Final Gather on each other. With this off, everything casts on everything. Small objects may cast Final Gather on large objects and result in blotches in a rendering. What I'll do is push this fall-off distance up, putting the stop at, let's try 144 inches and see how it looks. I'll hit Render again, and now I should get a better render time. It was definitely faster in Final Gather, but I can see a dramatic difference. Where I had a nice soft light under that canopy over the driveway, now it's very dark, as are my soffits. And so this distance of 144 is too limiting, and I need to boost it up. However, that Final Gather went much faster. The rendering itself is still taking the same time, but it serves as a way to drastically reduce that Final Gather time. We need to get the right distance in there, though, so we don't get black surfaces and odd-looking renders. My render time came down to 1:13. So somewhere in here is a happy medium. I'd like to have everything contribute Final Gather on everything else, but that's a huge hit in time. I'll bring up this stop distance to 240 and see how it looks. This should get me good Final Gather in that roof without taking a lot of time casting Final Gather everywhere. I'll see a slight increase in the time in here, but again, it'll limit down both time and Final Gather artifacts. We can see in here in another test render that even 240 is not enough, and so I'll bring this up yet again. I'll try 360 and hit Render. This should let it have enough in here, but there's one more thing I can do. My Final Gather max trace depth is actually fairly low. I'm going to bring this up to 12 and bring up the reflections as well. This way I have a little bit more bounce quality in the Final Gather, allowing it to bounce between surfaces more. It's starting to work, although I'm still a little darker in that canopy than I'd like to be. What we can do is actually introduce another light if we need to uplight that surface instead of simply relying on bounce light. Alternately, we can simply leave it alone and let it fall into the shadows, or take this fall-off stop off and just let the light bounce everywhere. You have some options in your rendering, and they do affect the look of the image, but they can also drastically affect time. So it's worth considering where we go with Final Gather and how we optimize, either in a radius or by interpolating those points. I'm starting to get a little bit of light back in the canopy, so I know I'm on the right track. This is again where an extra light just to uplight that surface might help and keep that time down. The good news is my render time is 1:16, which is still reasonably low, and my image still has that same quality to it. I'll play with this a little bit more, and even with the extra depth and bounces there, it's still looking, well, soft at a reasonable time.